Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for coming. It's great to see such a terrific turnout. As always, before we get going, I want to thank Howard Weeder and the Canada Excellence Research Chair and the Global Institute for Water Security for underwriting this seminar series. And today it's a real pleasure to welcome Claudia Pahl-Wostl. Claudia is a professor and the director of the Institute for Environmental Systems Research at the University of Osnabrück in Germany. Claudia is with us for a few days. She's had some great interactions today, I think, with colleagues in SENS and some of the postdocs and PhD students at the Global Institute. She'll be here for part of tomorrow, so if anyone would like to make a special arrangement, do let us know at the end of the talk today. Claudia is really an international thought leader in water governance, and she leads an interdisciplinary research program on governance and adaptive and integrated resource management, and the role of society and societal learning. Before going to Osnabrück, Claudia was at ETH Zurich, a very prominent institution. We've had several folks from there visiting us, and also at EOWAG, which is also in Zurich, this Federal Institute for Aquatic Science and Technology. She's held many positions, but was, I think for 10 years or so prior to her current position, was involved with mathematical modeling, and I think her undergraduate training really comes out of chemistry and a more physical sciences discipline. So this gives her a very interesting perspective, I think, on water governance. She's very active with many groups. She holds concurrent positions as a senior research associate at the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis in Austria. She's also a senior research fellow at the Resilience Center in Stockholm, and has many appointments with other committees. She's president of the Integrated Assessment Society and is involved as an editorial board member of about 5 or 6 journals, Ecology and Society, the Environmental Modeling and Software, International Journal of Water, to name a few. So it's really a thrill to have someone like Claudia with us for a few days. I know many students are kind of soaking up this time, and we'll be looking forward, Claudia, to hearing your talk today on water governance.
But despite of all my activities, I still have time to do research and even writing a book, imagine, yeah? And also talking a lot and discussing with students, and it's always a real pleasure. So thanks, first of all, for inviting me to give the opportunity to present some of our work, where I talk about our work. You see this slide is populated by quite a lot of acronyms. So I work quite a bit in international programs, but also quite a bit on European programs. So what I present here is also been developed over the past decade or so in an international context. I focus here on water governance, and I'm aware that probably have quite an interdisciplinary audience, try to convey you more general thoughts about why it is important. And if you has been in, would say, past decade, more and more discussion has been on water governance as an important issue. You see, water, a crisis of governance, that was already the Second World Water Development Report, that was very strongly, perhaps for the first time, spelled out. There has been recently, the OECD has launched a whole program, Water Governance Initiative, to share experiences on dealing with what they call the water crisis is a governance crisis. And also, it's more or less water governance as a field of research has largely emerged over the past decade. What I've done here is I just looked at publications on Scopus, a database that have in the title keywords or abstracts that either have water governance or governance. So I just wanted to show more as a kind of benchmark in this, where you can find these key terms, and you just see over the past decades, past decade, this field has really started to develop. Partly also, as I would say, probably response to the kind of perceived need to understand better water governance and improve it. So now everyone is talking on water governance, but what do you really understand by it? Just reflect yourself. If you had to explain, I'm sure most of you may have at least used the word, would have to explain it. How would you explain it? Is governance and government the same? No, it's not. Is governance governing without government? Some people think it's neither. So governance, and I give you the definition I used in my recent book, is it's partly also built on definition that was given by Oren Young, It's a social function, let's say. It's a kind of activity, and in particular, in this case, on water, it's really dealing with the regulation of development and management of water resources, setting the context under which water management operates, and it's target-oriented. It somehow is supposed to lead a certain, to achieve a certain state of water resources and delivery of water services. And we say water governance is a function, and then, I said I'm a system scientist, a system itself that is performing this function is comprising a lot of elements, political, social, economic, and administrative elements, operate at several levels of society. And on one hand, you have institutions. When I use the word institutions, I talk about the rules, the regulations, norms, encoded practices, but as well as actors and their interactions. So you can say that the notion of governance tries to embrace the complexity of all the elements that are in place for societal steering to really keep, in this case, a resource in a certain desirable state. It does justice to the complexity of what really is required to understand water governance, but also it's a real challenge if you try to improve and understand it, to embrace this complexity and really develop improved knowledge on why we have a governance crisis and what needs to be changed. So if I talk about water governance, it's this kind of understanding that underlies much of my work. Now, the topics that I want to address in the next 45 minutes or so, hopefully I will manage well with the scarce resource of time, cover quite a bit of ground. First, why? Why do we need transformation? Then what, when we talk about transformation of governance systems, what needs to change and how do we understand a governance system and what needs to change, but how? And then we talk not about transformation of governance, but governance of transformations. At the end, elaborate a little bit on kind of global developments and some discourses and also a new global program that might also be interesting for this Water Security Institute. First, why? Need for transformation. A whole range of governance failures have been identified. We have inappropriate settings, fragmentation, lack of horizontal and vertical coordination, no sectoral coordination, no coordination across levels. A lack of implementation of governance arrangements, difference in different countries, capacity problems, also lack of political will, asymmetric power structures. Focus more often on technical and neutral science approaches to analyze problems, identify solutions, very often ignoring more the political economy dimensions of issues, but also the prevailing governance and management paradigms, and that's much of where also my work has focused in past decade, lead really to also an appropriate way, I would say, of trying to manage the resource sustainably, in particular, lead to increasing trade-offs between human and environmental water security. Let me just elaborate a little bit on this last point. So that has been a very influential paper that was published by my colleague, Charlie Versch-Marty. We jointly chaired the Global Water System Project a few years ago in Nature. By the way, Charlie will be here 2 weeks from now, so I'm sure you'll hear more on this from him. And what he looked at, it looked at patterns of threat to human water security and to biodiversity. And you note here the different kind of combinations, whether threat to biodiversity is low or high, and threat to human water security is low or high. And you see red is where you have a high threat to both human and water security and biodiversity. Typically more in the kind of poor countries, but also underdeveloped countries with a lot of complex water problems. But then we have areas, and that's most of the more developed economies, where you have still a pretty high threat to biodiversity and about low threat to human water security. So it seems that much of the human water security was achieved by also still, at least to the detriment of the environment, but definitely not improving it very much. And the areas where the threat to biodiversity and human water security are low are the areas which are not very much populated. So that's probably not a solution. Just probably not getting rid of humans. That's not the way how we want to proceed. We need to somehow consider how we reduce this kind of trade-offs. And they are very evident, not only by this study, that the study really captured very much what we know also from other kind of evidence. This is, for example, the results of the classification of rivers that we had to do in Europe, because we have a new regulation that entered into force in 2000, that we have to improve the state of our freshwater bodies. And there we classified, this is for Germany, classified all our water bodies in terms of chemical and ecological quality. And you note here that the chemical, wait a second, here with the chemical quality, the water quality as such that you can measure, it's pretty good. We have improved at least the surface waters quite a bit. I should say we have still quite a bit of problems with the groundwater, since we have to deal with this more agriculture related, but surface waters have been improved. But here you still see the ecological state is really in a poor shape. It's habitat regulation, the whole morphology. And that has not at all been improved. And that's more or less you find this in other water bodies in other countries in Germany. And that's why also the big threat of biodiversity comes about. It's not only water quality, it's much more that needs to improve. And what is an example? So why is it that rivers are so different? This is just a picture that I hope you see it in terms of light. On the left, you see here still the Athabasca in Canada. I made this picture. I like to cycle, so I was there on a mountain looking on the Athabasca when I was at a water policy conference in Banff some years ago. And you see here, this line here, that is a road. Yeah? And what you see here is also one of my favorite holiday destinations, that is the Rhone in Switzerland. The straight line is a river. So more or less what we have changed, our rivers are highways for water with the concomitant implications. They are pretty efficient to drain the landscape, but sometimes even increasing the threat for flooding. So this means that, but also what is evident here, it's not that necessarily in Canada you're just so incredibly environmentally friendly that you leave much space to your rivers and so forth. At this area, just entering out of the Rockies, there is not too much competition for space. I think 2 years ago there was a huge flood in Calgary where it was implications that people are settling in the floodplain, and suddenly they are astonished when they start to get flooded. So in this respect, one has started to rethink the way how one deals with this kind of flood management. But in the end, you could say that when we look at these expected trade-offs between human and environmental water security in more exploited river basins, by the way, that's work where we also try to have a large database to really see more robust patterns evolving on that. Partly it's summarizing also a bit what Charlie Verge-Marty has shown in his analysis. But if you look here on, we used also this notion of David Gray on hydrocomplexity, low and high hydrocomplexity, low and high economic institutional strengths, and water security for humans and the environment. It's that high human water security is achieved at least to the detriment of the environment. In some of our countries, we have at least started to improve again a little bit because we are sufficiently wealthy, you could say, but in countries where you have also high hydrocomplexity, this could, for example, be really high water scarcity, like in the Colorado, or also in the Rio Grande. There you also really achieve comparatively high human water security to the detriment of the environment. And the question is really, are these kind of practices sustainable? Not only because we have really major implications, negative implications on the environment, but also more in the long term, is this kind of water security that is seemingly high, really high in the long term. So I illustrate this more in terms of what I consider that it's not, and that why people have started to rethink with the practices to manage extremes, dependent on the kind of current practices and how they made and have to change in the future. So extremes is droughts and floods, and if we have here a climate variable, like for example precipitation, that has a kind of normal variability. Yeah? And then we just always try to push the boundaries for this kind of variability, where I say, right, we want just to live in areas like in Phoenix, for example, in the US, where we have in principle no water, but humans want to live there and want to settle and want to have agriculture. But we also want to live in areas, we want to settle in floodplains, where there is sometimes excess water. We build dams, we have irrigation. But then we have some kinds of acceptable risk thresholds. You can't protect infinitely, it gets too costly. You somehow have certain risks in terms of floods, and that is a picture of Germany. Or you have also drought risk. The left is a picture of Australia, where there was this huge this millennium drought that they had pretty severe a few years ago. And then the idea is somehow who decides what are acceptable risk thresholds. And we still have regulation in Europe about you have to protect against the centuries or millennium floods, but some of you may have heard about this idea of non-stationarity of time series and climate change. Perhaps all of our analysis of our numbers that we have are not any more valid to support this kind of risk assessments. And in particular, when you look at climate change, just in this tail, things get more and more uncertain. And you could say what we've been doing, we've just pushed, by precaution, we say we have no damage, but we push more and more the boundaries of damage. But when you then have damage, it becomes always some existential and threatening, because we have so much assets in landscapes in terms of floods, but also in terms of droughts, so much also economic prosperity. Livelihoods of people depend very much on the availability of water. So this seems not to be the best way in terms of managing extremes, phrasing it carefully. And at least in terms of floods, there has been a general kind of change in attitude to move to a very different way of dealing with floods. Less so probably, yes, with droughts, because the implications of moving to dealing with water scarcity might be even stronger. But let's just have a look here on this whole flood issue. The kind of approach, which is now very much one of the countries that has promoted it very strongly, has been the Netherlands, where there has been some insights that the way of just always keeping the water out of the landscape has its limits in terms of guaranteeing security for the population. But in other areas, so the whole notion of we need to give rivers more room, living with water. So the current dominating paradigm that you can quantify risk and you implement optimal technical solutions, and you mainly work here with kind of large-scale technology, has started to be replaced, and that's not only more globally, by the idea we have to be a bit more like building multifunctional, resilient landscapes, work much more with natural buffering capacity, have, for example, flooding areas which are combining the ecosystem services approach with technical infrastructure. But also we have a different way of dealing with risk. Risk is not only a technical issue, it's a perception issue, more participatory risk evaluation, and more negotiation about integrated solutions. And that is a real transformation, not only thinking, but really to move there. There have been areas also, some where really this already is implemented with success. For example, one success story where the real transformation of the whole way how the river is managed, and also of the governance structure, is the Emscher, a tributary of the Rhine. It used to be one of the most polluted rivers in Europe, more a sewage channel a few decades ago. And so that's how it looks now. And sometimes they have really delegations internationally coming along and trying to understand why this miracle happened, that things are changing now so much. So you see here it was a big coal mining area, and that were the coal mines. And you see that the Emscher was dead. It was more or less put in concrete and was red and all kinds of colors, but not how a river would look like. And now that's how it starts to look today. Much more changes in the morphology, clean water. But I should say also part of the driver for this change has been also a decline of the coal mining industry. So it was not only insight that you need somehow to change a river, it was also partly since the whole region transformed. And so there was a huge transformation also in very much how to use the landscape. But also when we look here in terms of floods, you see here that is the current idea, and they are just starting to give the Emscher more space, so they want to have it having a bit more meandering river. But still you see it's confined to the space that is available. Probably they have to buy a bit of agricultural land. Sometimes the conflicts when we move into this is a bit more severe. And in many areas it didn't work. We had here this disastrous flood. I've just been reminded that there was also one in Calgary, obviously in the same year. In Germany, here in this corner here where you see this kind of picture you could have seen 10 years ago, 2002, we had also a huge flood in the Elbe Basin. It's also Grimma that looks pretty similar. The only thing you see the difference in the size of the trees, and nothing has changed. So somehow there was a big need to have different kind of flood protection, and perhaps people have to move outside of these kind of risk zones. But that is then a bit of a difficulty in terms of sometimes it has serious implications in terms of, as I said, land use patterns. And people often feel that perhaps now there's a flood, people tend to forget very fast. So, and We did some analysis on changes in flood management. It seems that you have recurring crises and that each crisis helps a bit to move things further, but seems to be that you always need another crisis, and sometimes you may better do it prior to crisis. But anyway, I think one of the big issues that was also sometimes that people, for a long time, these issues were not tackled in an appropriate way, was there was a failure to acknowledge that these are really messy problems. In water management, we just have a very strong technological engineering tradition, and often the idea was we need to, the problems have to be structured well. We have more structured problems where it's high consensus on that's what has to be done, where's the problem, and also the consensus, what is the solution. Because I think much of water pollution and so forth has definitely been, everyone wanted to have partly rivers to be again more clean. But now I think many of the things, and even with pollution, when you move away from building wastewater treatment plants to diffuse pollution, things get already a bit more messy. We have really messy problems where you have low consensus on factual knowledge, sometimes big uncertainties, but there's also big disputes about what should be done and what is the appropriate solution. And that requires different ways, also in terms of how knowledge is used, how risks are assessed, and how governance settings need to be designed in order to deal with these kind of issues. And that's, I think, one of the big challenges that we have to face to really do this appropriately. So that was more kind of summary to see a bit why, and which is a kind of probably our direction in terms of paradigm shifts we need to change in terms of water governance. But when we talk about transformation, what needs really to transform, and how can we also from a scientific perspective address the issues to better understand, as I said, from understanding to transforming, what needs to change. So we did quite a bit of research and analysis in order to really improve our understanding really on what I say is the performance of governance system. And you could say more from a simple system analytical approach, transformation means I have a current system, I move to a future system, I talk somehow, it's a dynamic state, it's not static, but obviously somehow you have a state, and you need to transform. And what we try to understand is here, as I said, is on one hand, would be the ideal thing that we understand the water governance system, how is the system as such as it is in place affecting its performance, and what is the influence of context. Why do I highlight this diagnostic approach so much is that we had in water governance a long tradition of conveying simple panaceas. There were problems, all right, government is inefficient, so we have to have privatization. So, and other kinds of simple recipes. There has been not much work to really try to understand better, despite of all the discussion on water crisis, on trying to understand the kind of relationships and try to build on that some improved thought about with the directions of needs for change. So performance could be, for example, really how well are governance arrangements implemented, obviously how to deal with environmental issues, is water security also achieved, but also, for example, one of the performance measures we developed was adaptive capacity to deal with climate change. But, or for example, resilience could be one performance measure. And context is really the kind of settings that you have, governance, environmental settings, that also develop very much, determine very much the kind of success. And what we have, just to give you, as I said, based on the definition I introduced before, we looked at institutions, regulatory, but also paradigms, which you could say is a kind of cultural cognitive institutions, actor networks, power structures, cooperation, coordination structures, multi-level interactions, and cross-sectoral integration. Just to put this in practice is a big issue because you don't have the kind of data available. We have, of course, we did a kind of study where we compared quite a few basins across the world, but how do you get access to comparable data on a larger range of basins? That's something that is also, I think, something where we need also to improve to build our knowledge base. So what we did, for example, in this respect was one comparative analysis, just to show you one example. That was a project funded by the European Union, and we're moving from panaceas to more diagnostic approach, this context-sensitive analysis and recommendations. And we analyzed, as I said, water governance systems, context and performance, And we had 26 national basins, used different methods to get the information from these basins in a knowledge base that we can compare it. It's also available online. Anyone who wants to have a look can have a look at it. We did use statistical regression, but also we used a method that I think is very promising to look in this kind of analysis, what is called qualitative comparative analysis. It was a fuzzy set, QCA. That is more analysis that looks at configurations of factors, like what are the configurations of factors in your governance systems that lead, for example, to high or low performance. And the interesting thing in this method is that it must not be symmetric for low and high performance. So the kind of combination of factors that lead to low performance, it must not be that just the presence or absence of certain factors lead to high or low performance differently. So it really embraces the complexity, or we sometimes call the equifinality of these kind of issues, that different pathways may lead to similar kinds of constellations. Just really to a very interesting method. But anyway, the kind of insights we got from this analysis was, we have advanced climate change adaptation. We look very much also at adaptive capacity. Is strongly related to polycentric governance. And when I talk about polycentric, I mean decentralization of power and coordination. Yeah, it's both, the combination of it, not only decentralization. And innovative ways of dealing with uncertainty. Efforts towards decentralization have often led to fragmentation, rather to this kind of polycentric regimes. So there was one kind of thought that decentralization is the solution to everything. Often it was not at all the case, but of course it often didn't really deal with the real governance problems. And we need to develop more general guiding principles and good practices for implementation that still can be tailored to context. So rather than implementing one principle everywhere. And finally, which was very interesting, I think one of the first studies that really could show that, was the central role of institutional development, and we measured it here by the Corruption Perception Index. And that proved to be more important than economic development for both high and low performance. So you have many countries where you have laws on paper, but they are not implemented. And that's also one of the issues, that decentralization doesn't deal with this kind of more general governance problems. So that's a little bit gives an idea about what are factors that are currently, that might be desired, polycentricity, more functional governance, you could say, respect of good governance principles. Because what is important, when I showed you this first graph, I don't want to convey at the minute that we develop the blueprint of an ideal future system. But if we want to transform and change, we need to have at least some ideas of what needs to transform, and perhaps a certain idea of the kind of future governance systems that we need, that in order to improve how we're doing today. Now I come to the next point, more the governance of transformation, one of also main topics that we are working on. The question is, how and to which extent can you really govern transformative change? Because you said it's pretty complex kinds of systems and structural transformation, and the question is, can anyone really steer and control that? And we developed, a couple of my own work, a kind of evolutionary concept on transformative change and societal learning. It builds more on this concept of triple loop learning and transformative change in organizations. And also one other person who worked quite a bit on this, using this concept, was Derek Armitage. Some of you may know him, he's from Waterloo, colleague with whom I communicate. And this triple loop learning concept tries, or at least conceptualizes, a learning concept that you may have actions and that lead to a certain outcome. And the actions are determined by frames, certain ways that you consider what is feasible, what is possible. Yeah? And that is determined also by the context, societal norms and other kind of issues, or everything that is stabilizing a current structure within you are. And generally, when people learn, you first of all, they expect learning that you may not be entirely satisfied with your outcomes is single loop learning, which means an incremental improvement of established routines. That could, for example, just be, all right, not sufficient water, we need just to increase irrigation efficiency. We need to divert rivers. If there's no water around it, we get it in California, we get it from Canada, just with a big pipeline. Or in Europe, they wanted to get the Ebro to Barcelona. desalination plants, improved purification technologies, all the kind of just not really changing whether you could say do the wrong things better, wrong in quotation marks, but not thinking whether the things that they're doing are right. Double loop learning means reframing. People really start to question the kind of things that are currently done. The question would be more, are current land use practices sustainable? Do we need more cross-sectoral policies like this water energy food nexus, very different ways of managing floods? So that I would say in many areas we're already moving more towards this reframing. But then the big issue comes is, and that's why it's more an evolutionary kind of approach, how do you really transform such systems? You may need new regulatory frameworks, change in management practices, capacity building, paradigm shift in education. And it's much more, I would say, to convey more narrative and exploratory research process and optimal design process, how we move in this direction, where probably innovative approaches are also implemented, meeting some constraints, and more interactively, things are changing more on the structural level, but also in the practice level. And definitely, this is a kind of multi-level challenge to really move here from discourse to action. And embedding this now, get another picture in a more multi-level perspective. What could that mean? If we say, right, that is both an analytical lens, we use this to try to understand transformation processes, but also to some extent also try to design them. This means you may have here different levels. More, you may have on one hand innovation and learning platforms. You may have here more the general governance and production system where you have more actor networks in place, but also this is embedded in the overall societal system. And here where innovation and learning takes place, I just highlight this a little bit, we did also some work to better understand the nature of innovation and learning, the nature of knowledge, because much of the work that some of you have read my work, is also been on social learning and participatory settings. And here comes in more this whole notion of understanding messy problems. On one hand, you want to deal with the problem and task, but when people interact in this kind of, let's say, innovation communities, they also have to understand that there is a social relational issue. So the way, the kind of solution that they see may very much determined by the role they have in a community. So for example, to try to promote this kind of learning, we use this kind of participatory modeling, where people also jointly try to also communicate the kind of perception they have on the system. Because often it's not so simple to say what's right or wrong. It's just to be able to really constructively discuss a difference and find innovative and new solutions. So that's one thing. So you could say, all right, this kind of multi-level approach would be that these kind of learning platforms are really influenced by the kind of upper level interactions in terms of actor networks, but also norms, societal norms and practices. But also in the end, they also there is a feedback from this kind of learning. That's a bit this kind of evolutionary, it's not an easy picture, but this is a kind of evolutionary perspective that we have started to develop to try to understand this kind of multi-level learning processes. A little bit related also, some of you may know this transition work by the people of Rotmans and others that try to look at this transition management. So what is then required for transformative change from our first experience that we have, that we can already draw some conclusions on a couple of analyses, is that again these polycentric structures need more flexible and effective coordination across sectoral boundaries and levels, a balance between top-down and bottom-up processes. So often, as we have too often in many fields that are either top-down or bottom-up is good. We find in many cases we somehow need a balance of both. Effective link between informal settings and formal policy processes. What do I mean by that? This kind of innovation platforms, we often see also shadow networks and so forth that we have analyzed, that informal networks are important to support integration of different kinds of knowledge, but also with experimentation, innovation, and also to overcome entrenched interests, because often in formal settings, people negotiate too much and sit on their positions. However, if you leave it entirely in the formal realm, often it's simply that if things are not codified, or often if there are individuals that really try to bring in, for example, we analyzed one policy process in Hungary, where the link between the shadow network and also influencing new flood policy was very independent on an individual. We call these people social entrepreneurs. This is not too unusual to find this. is fragile. If in the end you don't have this, it's not somewhere ending up in some rules, in some practices, and shared practices. So that's the kind of really important to find how can this link between this more informal setting and formal policy really be improved and also made be more effective. However, you may, perhaps you remember that a few slides ago, I talked about the importance of, or the probably negative effect of things like corruption. And you could say, right, informal settings must always be very positive in terms of water management and water governance. Indeed, when the kind of image that I convey here is also linked to an understanding that you work more in where you have really effective formal institutions. So here I have a picture that was developed by political scientists, Kalbalowitsky, that kind of approach some years ago. They looked at governance in Latin America, and they were looking on one hand, do you have effective or ineffective formal institutions? That means in practice, they look at regulation. Is you have functional jurisdiction, or is it simply not operating at all? And I would say Canada, in Germany, we have kind of effective formal institutions. People can go to court. We have legislative, jurisdiction, and executive are pretty well developed. And then you have more compatible or conflicting goals between formal and informal institutions. And the kind of picture I just conveyed, and where we work at least at the moment a lot, we try to support a lot also Germany many programs, citizen fora and so forth, trying to support, develop new ideas on policy, on energy change, not only in the water field, is to find this complementarity between this network governance, you could say the informal settings, and formal institutions to really capitalize on the strengths of both, and you find somehow optimal coherence between these two kind of approaches. But we may have in some countries much more competition where you have the lack of coherence. And that's, I would say, in these cases, I'm much more in favor of supporting the kind of approaches. I work quite a bit with Elinor Ostrom. In these cases, the question is, how do you move? In the end, you want obviously have more effective formal institutions, not rent-seeking individuals who just improve their own performance. You may need to really move more to really strengthen public voice, to move more to strengthening and change the relationship, that you have more the substitutive formal institution, that the kind of push towards an improved sustainability may come from these kind of network governance approaches, which would be implications, for example, how sometimes there's some funding and things are distributed and done by the big programs. But I think that's the kind of route we may have to follow, supporting here more these bottom-up developments. All right, time is progressing, but I make also some progress. So we had this year in terms of, I was here at these points in terms of informal settings. 2 more points I want to make in terms of what is required for transformative change. I also consider an effective implementation of the ecosystem services concept. I don't go into this too much in this talk, no time, but we work quite a bit on it. I think it can be much broader than only bringing in a value, market-based value for nature. It really can communicate and also communicate this kind of complexity, interdependence between humans and nature. And also I would say a combination between governance modes, what we call governance modes in this governance research, markets, bureaucratic hierarchies, and networks. What do I mean by governance modes? They describe, and I very much endorse to the distinction between markets, bureaucratic hierarchies, and networks. They describe a certain logic of political steering, dominant forms of interactions, and preferred instruments. We sometimes have countries where certain modes dominate, and if you sometimes look also progression in environmental and water policy, often different modes have been dominating. As I said, on one hand, you have really the more command and control approach, like hierarchical governance. You have the government there makes rules and people have to comply. More market-based approaches, much more government service delivery, much more economic instruments, incentive-based, very much prevalent. Also market-based, for example, water markets, what is very, I would say, popular in Australia and also I would guess a bit more also countries here, but increasingly also so obviously in Europe. And network governance, you much more work on voluntary agreements, arrangements, participatory and so forth. And as often we have seen waves that government was inefficient, put the market in, market spoiled it up, now people have to solve it, we have networks. But in the end, what seems to work, and we haven't yet been so good in terms, I would say, science to really better develop analytical tools and also develop what works, which kind of combinations work under which kind of conditions. And some people we really need this kind of meta-governance, and I would say this combination of governance modes is crucial. And I consider this is more a reflexive process of learning, where we really need to evaluate and adapt governance approaches and also really consider how we best combine these various approaches to really address these complex societal challenges. Okay, that's more or less a bit of a picture glimpse of what we understand really about governance of transformation. Definitely, can we really govern and steer it? I think we have an improved understanding, at least to put better processes in place that really support this transformative capacity, which doesn't mean that you can really control it like a machine, but you definitely have at least some handles in place that you can support transformative change. But in terms of, do we really have science for transformative change? When I talk about all this, that make us optimistic that things are really moving in the right direction, what we consider in terms of increased sustainability. I think there is much discourse on radical change and reframing of the debate on water resource governance and management in some areas. And and you have much innovative legislation in quite a few countries. However, now there comes always a caveat. The potential for innovation is not very much used. I can't say that, for example, we have new legislation on the Framework Directive, which would allow more adaptive management, that suddenly things are really changing entirely. There is slow progress sometimes in the implementation of legal frameworks, but also there's still major barriers for going from reframing to transformation. And I make a very broad statements that are different facets in different countries where we are, but this overall pattern is pretty similar. So there's not too much reason to say that we are already on a right path. But nevertheless, I want to end a bit more with some more positive notions. I would still say I'm optimistic because I think there are quite some few interesting also, and I still think we need here global transformation, not only local. There are some interesting discourses and policy processes that are currently in place that show, at least with science, that things are moving. On one hand, the water energy food nexus, that was perhaps a bit of response to the lack of IWM to really build the strengths to implement, to manage water in an integrated way. It's more a claim to adopt an integrated perspective, this nexus perspective, to could say build more one level playing field for different sectors, that you need to start from the beginning. It was interestingly promoted from governments, by the German government in the Nexus conference in preparation of the Rio +20 summit. And really it wants to, attempts to support sectoral integration, and also in the end it requires also more flexible management for implementation. And the interesting point is it really pops up everywhere, huge networks and research activities, a huge program also in the US to build a huge nexus model. So, and even we have now the FEW nexus, not the BEF nexus, so food, energy, water nexus, which is also good because food people start also to work on that. So that is a little bit of a sign that perhaps these more integrated approaches are getting more space. The next is water security. I probably don't have to talk much about water security here as an important concept. I've put here one definition that I think conveys well that water security is very much also a governance issue, because it's by Gray and Sadov. I like it because they highlight this importance of acceptable quantities and qualities and acceptable levels of risk. It's a risk-based approach, but the notion of what is acceptable is very much a negotiation and also governance issue to get this right. And it's one hand you say it's interpreted broadly, is it a disadvantage or advantage, but still it can support dialogue among different groups in science, but also in policy. And I think it has really the potential to develop operational indicators for really monitoring change. And then the third is more this whole notion of green infrastructure. You could say ecological engineering is there since quite some time, but now suddenly everyone, and that was promoted here, that you see this beautiful meandering river. This is a change in flood management paradigm. Environment is infrastructure. We need, that's the kind of paradigm I have just talked about when I talked the change in flood management paradigm. everyone, EPA has policies, European Union has policies. And again, you see, it's interesting. This has shot up, skyrocketing in the past decade or so. At least a sign, and it's not only in science, but a sign that this is picked up and it starts to get implemented. So an attempt also to move here in this direction. And finally, I still consider that the SDGs, we just had a conference on SDGs and water in Bonn in August. They have now been adopted. It's develop a transformational agenda for our planet. And I would say, despite of all the problems we have sometimes with the UN policy, that still it's putting a context that can be used when implemented in order to really support transformative change. Now, to summarize here more on the global level, I put you here this Kingdon's multiple stream model. Political scientists may be aware on that. Kingdon developed a model that you say, when do you have windows of opportunities for change? And he said you have a problem stream, a policy stream, and political stream have come together. And that generates opportunity. The understanding of a problem, policies in place, and I think we have quite a few now in place, or at the global level, but on the political stream, actors in the political arena and public mood. And I would say in particular here at this level, that is a critical level, because I would say awareness for problems in that bad and policies, as I just highlighted the SDGs, there's quite a few policy processes, we have new instruments. And we need leadership at different levels. But I would also say leadership in science. And that brings me here to my last point. I probably have to be a bit faster here, because I want to also say, what is the role of science? We have to move more from problem identification to more the co-design of evidence-based solutions. That has been very strongly also the implication of Future Earth. There's a new global change program. We had a 10-year program, Global Water System Project, where in the end we say, right, we have really, we accumulate, also Charlie Schmarty, we accumulate so much, saw his results before, evidence on problems. But somehow, compared to the evidence we are accumulating, we can't be really very much satisfied in terms of what is ending up in policy and the solutions. And that's why, in the end, you have to also work in the co-design of solutions if you really want problems to be addressed and knowledge to really be effectively implemented. And that is now a new program that we have been launching. 2 weeks ago, the Secretariat moved now from Germany to Brisbane in Australia. It's a global program. It's now a Sustainable Water Future program. Just a few slides on what we intend to do here, and I'm done. How did it come about? We had 2013, we had the conference of the Global Water System Project, where we had a Bonn Declaration on global water security, where we really had this, we need to move much more knowledge to action agenda, be much more solution-oriented. Many people signed it, including the mayor of Bonn. We had then a special issue in a journal, a current opinion in environmental sustainability, where also I and other colleagues, we developed a bit more a blueprint, or at least a type of ideas, what do we need for the next decade of global water research. Elements that are in it, of governance of transformation is essential. The state, we need still to monitor the state, but also water as a global agent, an agent of connection, but agent of change, because water is connecting everything. And we have a couple of principles that should be guiding our research in terms of robust knowledge, support good governance, enhance water security, and monitor progress. And just two kinds of major activities that we have to put this in place. On one hand, we want to implement a diagnostic solution-oriented assessment process in place. So what does it mean? On one hand, you make more synthesis of research, like the work of Charlie that has been doing more synthesis and building diagnostic tools, or the work I've been doing on 2in2go. Theorite, we have kind of solutions or these approaches together with people from policy that are emerging from that. And the question is, could they also be used on a more broader scale? Look at the impact when we move in trying to implement those, and also look a bit, right, redesign or reflect on the solutions based on impact. So a kind of global assessment process to use the available knowledge, look a bit at the kind of solutions we need, but also analyze potential suggestions. Solutions could be very new ways of new management paradigms, but new ways of implementing, for example, the ecosystem services concept or whatever. It's not only technical solutions. So on one hand, this kind of global assessment process, we also work with the Global World Water Assessment Program that in terms of the World Water Development Report. But in parallel to that, and we haven't done so much before on the Global Water System Project, really to move more to, you don't design solutions or innovation in a global network, is it? But we are currently implementing a water solutions lab network. We really want to understand innovation processes. That's where we had these innovation platforms. We have also, I think there's one currently starts to get implemented in India, where you have much more innovations and try to bring together innovations, try to see how can they be tested, complemented, try to somehow exchange across learning, and probably feed also with this kind of solutions that they feed up again to this assessment process. So a little bit also implementing this notion of governance of transformation I had before. It definitely is a bit of an ambitious program. I'm aware of that, but at least that's a bit trying to meet the size of the challenge. This is, the water program of future Earth. All right, that definitely was a bit fast, given all, and probably may have been tired about having all seen all the various figures I've already shown to you. But we have also a design report where you can read a bit more about that, and perhaps also, the Institute, we could collaborate here in the future. Now, I come to conclusion. The scientific challenge ahead, apart from which also that we want to address here in our future programs, I think we need more coordinated action research to study and support learning innovation processes. I'm very much in favor of not only studying change from a distant observer, but engaging much more in transformative processes and building the analytical tools that you support learning across these kind of processes, because that's often what we are not doing. And develop more indicators for progress, that we really also see in which direction we are going, and do more comparative study, really implement this diagnostic approach, where we also need to work more on global and shared knowledge bases. And last not least, I hope that I was at least more also an incentive and inspiration to want to learn more, and I need to advertise here a book, just published, trying to summarize quite of the things that I've been doing over the past decade. And it's also the first volume in a whole series on water governance that I'm co-editing. It's not so that, oh, how many books do you want to write? No, not I'm writing it. It's a series and that I'm an editor of this series. So any one of you who has a great idea, wants to publish a book on water governance, co-edit this with Joita Gupta, are welcome also to talk to me. And with that, I thank you, and I'm looking forward to some good discussion.
Thanks, Claudia, for a really wonderful overview of water governance. Students in the class this morning read the 2 chapters from this book. Wondering if there might be a question or two lingering from class before we get going here. Looking at 1 or 2 that weren't able to ask a question this morning. Yeah.
Hi. My question was quite a simple one. Where do you think in the world today does the best water governance system exist in terms of your experience or observation?
Where the best water governance systems exist in the world? Oh, God.
And you can't say Germany.
At least I would say from, because when we did the kind of work in the analysis of what is the Untitled Chapter project, we had also rankings. I said, you need to publish your ranking. I said, all right. If apply place 1 or 2 is a big difference, I would say countries that really performed quite well were, for example, the Netherlands are quite good. They are not bad, but also parts of, we had the parts of Northern Europe. Germany is not so great always. It's not particularly innovative. I would say in Germany we're very good in complying with rules, but I think part of water governance is hasn't been much traditional innovation. But I have to say, when I have really to just put a caveat, we are good in complying with rules often, most of the time, but we have, as I said, we have huge problems, for example, with nitrate pollution of groundwater, where you have lots of rules that are not implemented. So when there's real major conflicts, and you may have heard about a German car producer who was pretty intelligent of complying with rules. These things happen as well. So I would say this is definitely kind of where you have innovative regulation. I think a country at least that tries a lot in terms of having, I would say, one of the best water laws in place is South Africa. Has an outstanding water law and really you could say developed as a model with people, but they have such an ambitious water law, but to put it in practice is a big challenge because they have no capacity. Probably they've the capacity in terms of technical skills, but also institutional capacity is not there. So that's a bit my current way.
Good. Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yes, Toddy.
What do you think are the antecedents to innovative government practices? What leads to more innovative government practices?
Toddy, could you ask for the mic just so it captures it? Sorry. What are the antecedents to more innovative governance practices? What are the things that lead up to stimulating that kind of innovation?
Depends a bit on the kind of innovation you talk to. On one hand, really, I would say, would put it more broader, what kind of innovation you talk about. Just to build a functional governance system, what I said in terms of if you have these very dysfunctional governance systems, like complying with good governance principles, it really is very much the public voice to cause more accountability and so forth. That was our experience, that you need to get the public voice to get a stronger, and this with many developing countries. That is but a more general question in terms of not innovation, but really improving the governance systems as such. Otherwise, innovation, it's often also individuals who have ideas. As I said, I don't think that innovation is generally coming from a top-down or a template, or from this, what I said, synthesis of solutions. But if we, for example, we looked at innovation in flood management approaches, and first of all, it's a long process. We looked at countries, we compared Hungary, Netherlands, for example, and Germany and others, and it's a long-term process. Often you had individuals who were not satisfied with a certain thing. Then you had a crisis. Crises are always good, where people start to think a bit, oh God, we need to improve something. But crises generally are not times of reflection. They often a bit an opportunity of a window for a year or so, where if you have an innovative ideas, perhaps you may have a chance that it get heard. But generally, after a crisis, governments want to fast show that they can deal with the problem. But often, for example, in one big flood, then at least some kind of innovative projects had started, and people, for example, moved more to these more ecological kind of approaches. And the next big flood already, there was opportunity to implement concepts that have been developed before. So crises are quite good. We also have noted that, for example, the Netherlands are pretty good in terms of supporting innovation, is that there is much more informal exchange between business, science, and policy. They have often this kind of commissions that work together. We don't have this kind of more. I've also been consulting in one of these commissions. And because I would still find it very remarkable that a country like the Netherlands is moving from controlling water to trying to really say, right, we need a very different kind of paradigm. It's not necessarily implemented, but these are the kind of elements that I think are interesting.
Maybe we need to follow the shock doctrine to be ready for change following disasters. Yeah, Maureen.
Claudia, thank you for the presentation. One of the criticisms of the literature in social learning was that it didn't account very much or very well for power relations. And I'm wondering, as you've moved from thinking about social learning to transformation in governance, what have you observed with respect to how power is theorized in the processes of transformation?
How power is what?
Theorized.
Theorized. Obviously, one thing in social learning is right. Generally, you look at power that you say, right, you need to facilitate processes to make sure that it's not dominated by powerful voices. Yeah? But I would say in social learning, power is a bit circumvented. It's not theorized at all. It's just somehow assumed that you can try to overcome it. I would say in transformation, there is much more work now that promotes very strongly like also Peter Molinga and others, who really push much more strongly about you are not allowed to ignore power relations and kind of actor networks constellations. And I would say that at least it's recognized more strongly. The question is, how in the end do you account for power? I would say it depends a bit on the kind of approach you've got. You may have power based on resources and power based on networks. You may have power based on formal kind of power. And I think we have to use at this different understanding of the governance setting, how power manifests itself, how you build trust, and how you can obviously try to build transformation processes that have a chance that not the most powerful voices are just dominating the direction. That's a bit, perhaps we can discuss a bit more about that, but I agree that it's not a trivial issue, but it needs to be taken into account.
One last question from Howard, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. I wonder if you could comment on the interactions and potential tensions between bottom-up and top-down governance on a watershed scale, because clearly at one level we need to manage water systems in an integrated way at a basin level. But also, there's a tremendous amount of energy and interest at the grassroots level in, for example, local associations with responsibilities for their own watersheds. But on the whole, I would say the experience here is that that's an active area, but there's a sense of a lack of empowerment from the bottom up.
A lack of empowerment.
Lack of empowerment, yeah. I wonder whether you had any observations.
On one hand, I said bottom-up, top-down also in transformation is sometimes you have new ideas coming also from, like for example, Hungary had new ideas that were developed in a kind of shadow network, very much bottom-up. But on the other hand, you also had a top-down process, new policies were implemented, and this was a kind of interaction. But more generally in terms of management, I think what is important, you just bottom up, you can't manage a basin only by assuming that local communities will develop their solution and somehow self-organize across the whole basin or across whole Europe or so forth. You need to have frameworks in place, but the frameworks should leave sufficient space for implementation, like also the water energy food nexus. I don't think that you can deal with this on integrating also top-down policies. So the Europe is really moving in this direction, having pretty strong policies like the framework directive, but these policies leave much more freedom for implementation at lower levels. But then you say about empowerment, who is supposed to participate? And not everyone wants to participate. For example, European citizens, hardly anyone knows that the framework directive exists. But in the end, you need, and that would require more time, and that's often not done. One needs to develop also for the implementation, if it's the implementation of policies, implementing authorities more thought about how do I show, for example, to the population or to citizens that certain measures that have to be implemented really will affect them. So instead of, for example, just again say this notion of the framework directive, you just put sometimes some water management plans on the web, and who is interested in that if you can read some more interesting stuff elsewhere. But in the end, if you, for example, build some facility in a certain region, people start simply not to like it. So really you have to develop more appropriate means in order to develop the kind of clear insights, implications, what does a certain measure that's implemented at a local level mean for the community, and that they can also engage in it. On the other hand, also that people may also participate in real implementation. When I talk about the framework directive, you could say you may not always need people to participate in an improvement wastewater treatment plant. But if you talk about new flood management, if you talk about ways of dealing with droughts and so forth, you will not be able to really transform and implement without engaging local communities that start to become aware of the problem, that translate it to an understanding what it means for their community, that start to develop also ways of how they could change, and that build ownership on a solution. Just another example, we had a big program, and that was more top-down program, to develop new ways of flood management in the Rhine. And so I thought, right, we have to build retention areas, great. And then we have retention areas, there was the WWF. We can also build more natural flooding so that we have a bit more restore the former floodplain. And then there were about 10 different kinds of these retention areas were supposed to be local polders to be implemented. And in all of these 10 polders, you had citizen initiatives protesting against it. All right, there will be more mosquitoes. Groundwater will come in my cellar. So after all this experience, people went to court. They said, perhaps it might not have been bad to involve people from the beginning. Yes, it should have been done so. So that instead of a polder is just put in front of them, that they start to discuss. Now they ship school classes to, that is our polder, and we are proud on it. So that shows on one hand the importance for this kind of transformative change to find acceptance with citizens, but also I think the solutions are not coming from the top, but you really need to collaborate with interest groups and citizens. It really is, but it really is a process that requires resources, and that's sometimes a little bit where I see that's not sufficient resources implemented. Anyway.
Okay. Well, this is great discussion, and Claudia, it's really been a pleasure to have you here today. This is a master class, I think, in water governance with so many wonderful international examples. We're all adjourning to Alexander's second floor for those that want to join. Otherwise, Claudia will be here for parts of tomorrow, so come and see me if you want to get in on her schedule at all. Thank you very much.